Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander technique teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska. I teach in Toronto, Canada as well, and these days mostly online. My guest today is Penelope Easton, who is an Alexander technique teacher who lives in County Clare, Ireland. And she originally read zoology at Cambridge, then trained in the Alexander technique, and then discovered Miss Goldie and worked with her for Miss Goldie being Margaret Goldie, one of Alexander's early assistants. Studied with her for 4 years, which set her on quite a lengthy journey to understand the difference between her teaching and most of the other teaching in England, I assume, at that time. She's also written a book called The Alexander Technique, 12 Fundamentals of Integrated Movement, and it will be published later this month. I'll put a link to Penelope's website, which will have information on how to order that book, which I have done, by the way. I ordered it directly from the publisher. I think it's cheaper to get it from the publisher than Amazon. So
Well, at the
just
moment, they've
at the,
got good discounts on
yeah.
it. So,
So we're going to do a series of conversations today, mostly based on Penelope's work with Miss Goldie, inspired by that work. And this is the first of the series we're doing now. And it's really going to be about how Penelope came to discover Miss Goldie and what her lessons were like and how that set her off on this 30-year journey to understand what Miss Goldie's all about. So after saying all that, welcome, Penelope. And um, could you say a little bit how it was that you came across a Margaret Goldie?
yes. Yeah, I took my first lessons back in 1983 because my back had gone into a spasm and I was pretty well cracking up at the time. And they were beautifully quiet and they calmed me down and they saved the day, which was fantastic. And I just fell in love with the technique straight off. And I had a series of teachers, first in Cambridge and then I moved to London. Um, and both from, I started with Carrington teachers, and then when I discovered Misha's school, I went to McDonald teachers, and then I did my training. And I didn't realize that I'd never really learned how to work on myself. I didn't discover that because, you stand in front of the chair, you get worked on, you do what you're told, you get
Yeah.
moved in and out of the chair. And we weren't taught how to work on ourselves, but I didn't know that until my training finished and I built a practice. And 6 months into my practice, I could not keep my use going. I didn't know what I was doing. And I was in a mess. And I thought, what do I do? And there was a whole choice of first generation teachers in London at that time. Um, and I went to Miss Goldie because John Hunter had been to Miss Goldie and he was the main assistant at Misha's and he was doing something so different and so beautiful. I thought, I want what John has. And if he got it from Miss Goldie, I didn't know if he got it from Miss Goldie, but
Yeah.
well, that's where I'll go. And so I did. I turned up, booked a lesson, which was a process in itself, by the way. Some friends who'd been gave me some cues. She will ask you how much you're going to pay her.
Right.
And she will ask you whether you're going to be a tourist. So I passed the interview on the phone, got a lesson, and it was great. It was calm, and she wore a hat. She was 86 at the time, very old-fashioned clothes, but rather somber. Um, and very nice lesson. Booked another one. Came the following week, and the gloves came off. The hat was off.
I can
I
imagine
sort of
that.
had the sense the hat kept it in. When
Yeah.
the hat came off, out came the temper. You know nothing about the technique.
Uh-huh.
You know absolutely nothing. She said, I was asking her questions. If Mr. Alexander could see what you were, could hear your questions, forgotten the phrase, um, you know, he would be turning in his grave if he could see what you are asking in the name of his technique. And which was really confusing because, you know, I'd had lovely teachers. They quite clearly did know about the technique, but she kept saying, you know nothing. Um, anyway, I carried on. She brought me to quiet and she taught me how just to give consent and let something happen from a place of quiet. But I carried on being a passive pupil because that's what I knew how to be. And lesson 6, she challenged me. I came in, she stood me in front of the chair. How many lessons have you taken so far? 6, Miss Goldie. I don't know why you bother. You have not begun to think for yourself away from here. She tiraded at me all lesson. I was in tears and a bit in my head thinking, I could walk out of this. I don't need this. And another bit of my head thinking, I'll show the old bat. So, which was a very healthy response, I think. So I went home and I stopped in front of my kettle. I didn't just, you know, lunge for it like I might normally do. I stopped and I brought myself to quiet like she'd showed me, but not feeling into my body, but bringing my mind to my brain up out of the way so that it was out of the way of my hand. And then I gave consent for my hand to move and it just moved and it encountered the kettle and just responded to the kettle. And when I lifted the kettle, it was with exactly the right response. And I'd never moved like that before. And in that moment, I made a whole shift. You know, there was a whole discovery process there. And something new began at that moment. And I went back ready to tell her about it next week, but she knew immediately, which was amazing. And I think what she taught me in that moment was that game that Alexander plays in Use of the Self, where he has to, in order to really discover how to speak in the new way, he has to come completely to quiet so that whatever stimulus he offers himself, he doesn't make a response. And then when he chooses to speak, his whole brain nervous system can organize it in a different way and something new happens. Because I don't know about you, Robert, but right from the beginning, I was asking, how did Alexander develop the technique? He had nobody putting his hands on him.
That
And I
was always the question. Yeah. There he was at the edge of the British Empire. And where did he come up with this? Yeah.
And I'd been asking it, and nobody had been able to give me an answer. And I felt that Goldie gave me at least one of the answers. I think there's more than one, but that was certainly one of the answers. And I worked with her for 4 years, and then we moved out of London. We moved to Sheffield. I had a baby, and life carried on, you know, like it does. And I started trying to understand what she'd given me because it was so different and it was so precise. It was, and this state of deeper quiet that I felt she brought me into, where my system, it wasn't just a pause, it was a real stop. That this deep quiet from which something could emerge out of me that I'd never done before, that nobody had ever done with me. And that was new. And so she died in 1997, and I was actually very ill at the time. And it was a few years before I'd recovered again. And I kept waiting for somebody to come forward and present her work, and nobody ever did. And so in the end, I wrote my little booklet, My Lessons with Miss Goldie, that you read.
Yep.
And did a workshop on it at the Oxford Congress. And that's where the Goldie workshop started. And that's also when I had the idea to write the book. And it's been 15 years in the writing, not 16 years. So it's all gone from there.
Yeah. It's just to insert a personal note of my own. I was in London in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and I actually did see her once. I was taking lessons with someone who was in the same office as she was in Soho. I caught a glimpse of her, and she looked very old-fashioned. I just remember getting that glimpse of her. But your experience with her, that the question you had, how do I work on my own? That in fact was answered for me by Marjorie Barstow. Very different approach than Miss Goldie. Marjorie would not have said, "What are you doing here?" But she was a tough old lady in her own way, really tough and very precise in her thinking. And she got me to actually start self-directing in an efficient way, which I had never, was not part of my training really, as far as I can remember. It's been a long time now. So, yeah.
Well, isn't that interesting? Excuse me, the cat's in the room. About that?
So much for the cat.
Well,
that was quick.
She's an old lady too, and I know once she starts yowling, she will yowl.
Yeah, yeah. So,
yes, it's interesting what you say there, that the mainstream technique, I mean, it has a lot of wonderful things, but somehow it doesn't quite, there's something that got sidelined, I think. Would you say something that somehow
well, I think
didn't make it into the mainstream education of us?
Well, just like you, when I was in London, there were even more probably people who trained with Alexander, and I went to pretty much all of them, not 100% because there were some political issues around who you could see or not see, but I explored pretty much anyone I could find. I wish I had, in fact, gone to see Miss Goldie instead of this other guy who was in her office, who was not that great. But it does seem like today, when Alexander teachers think about, well, who were the second generation teachers and lineages, let's say, it would be Carrington, MacDonald, Barlow. I don't know who else in England, Peter Scott, maybe. I don't really know that much about him. And then some people would know, oh yeah, there's Marjorie Barstow. And then there's some people in the States who went over there, went back to the States. And then very few people, they all know that Miss Goldie was one of his assistants, but they don't really see her as a strand of Alexander teaching, at least from what I could see.
No, well, she never had a school, of course, and I think
she did not train teachers.
You know what you've named. Scott worked alongside MacDonald, and one could also put the Walkers into that list, perhaps.
Sure.
Again, who were first generation teachers,
right?
Who had
the Walkers, right?
And Goldie never had a school, and she never advertised. She was a well-kept secret, and people had to sort of, I've heard tales of people going, behind Carrington's back and behind MacDonald's back, and certainly anyone from Misha's went behind Misha's back to go and see her.
Yeah.
She wasn't particularly liked by the establishment because I think she was so outspoken about, she didn't like what was happening in the mainstream schools. And we've gone on to my second question that I asked, why was Miss Goldie so angry?
Well, I wonder if we should answer that question in the next interview. What do you think?
Okay.
So we'll have covered your sort of initial history with her and your journey of self-discovery, which you will tell us about more in episode 2. How's that?
That's splendid, Robert.
So. We'll end this conversation. My guest has been Penelope Easton, an Alexander teacher in County Clare, Ireland. And we're doing a series on Miss Goldie and Margaret Goldie and her discoveries. And we'll do part 2 in just a moment. Thanks for being on this show.